everyone. Welcome to this bonus episode of The Greats of History, the podcast where we get to know people with the epithet of the Great and try to get past the honorific and understand who they were, what they did, and why some people seem to like them so much. I'm grateful that you're here. I want to especially welcome new listeners. I am so glad you found the show. This is the third bonus episode that I have put together. In the first two, I shared 3 new things that I have learned, first about Sargon of Akkad, then Thutmose III, since I released their episodes. Even as I keep working on the next episode in this series, I keep finding myself checking in on my old friends, wondering if I missed anything, and going a little deeper into their lives and stories. As with the prior bonus episodes, this one will share 3 new things that I have learned about Ramses II since I released his episodes a little while back. These aren't momentous, but each adds just a little extra highlighting, a little more perspective that helps us round out our view of Ramses. If you have not yet listened to the episodes on Ramses, don't worry. There are no huge spoilers in here, but I do hope that you will go back and listen. Over the course of his episodes, I referred to Ramses as self-obsessed. I doubt this would be considered a controversial statement. Not only did he just keep building grand monuments with colossal statues of himself, but he also recarved sculptures and inscriptions of his predecessors in his own image. He also put his personal cartouche on even more monuments, essentially carving Ramses was here on everything he could. El Barto would be proud. The guy either really liked his own name and image, or he wanted the people of his kingdom to be overawed by his omnipotence. Everywhere anyone looked, there he was. In all likelihood, it was both. As we've discussed in his episode, much of Ramses' projects serve the dual purposes of gratifying his monumental ego and some other important practical function, like facilitating commerce, endowing art and cultural establishments, or providing defensive fortifications for the border towns. Ego plus utility equals Ramses. Ramses was not the first pharaoh to embark on monumental projects to exalt his image. Far from it. Just think about the more than 100 pyramids built in the roughly 1,000 years of pyramid building between the 4th and 18th dynasties. In theory, any pharaoh could commission a building project, but only a select few could participate in a very special kind of celebration. Once a pharaoh reached their 30th regnal year, they were eligible to participate in something called the Heb-Sed Festival. They could then choose to celebrate this festival every 3 years thereafter until the conclusion of their reigns, i.e., until they died. This Jubilee festival was a public celebration of the king and a way for him to demonstrate that he was still working with the gods and goddesses on behalf of the people to maintain the sacred principle of Ma'at that we discussed previously. The Heb-Sed festival, something I have learned a bit more about since Ramses' episode aired, was one of the most ancient festivals in Egypt. In this festival, the pharaoh would be recognized as the successor of Narmer, the first pharaoh to unite Upper and Lower Egypt, and considered by many scholars to be the very first pharaoh of the very first dynasty. During the Heb-Sed festival, the pharaoh would offer gifts and sacrifices to a succession of gods and goddesses. Then, the pharaoh would be crowned anew, first with the white crown, symbolizing Upper Egypt, and then followed by the red crown, which represented Lower Egypt. Finally, the pharaoh would don a special kilt or skirt and run a ritual race course, in part to show his people that he was still fit enough to rule. After performing this feat of strength, the king would then be carried off in a raucous procession to yet more temples so he could continue to pay homage to the deities. The people would then feast and celebrate, offering their thanks to the pharaoh for his intervention with the gods on their behalf and toasting to his continued health and vitality. Of course, Ramses wasn't the first pharaoh to celebrate the Heb-Sed festival, but in typical Ramesseid fashion, he would put his own mark on it and set a new bar that no pharaoh before or after could match. As we've pointed out in prior episodes, life expectancy in ancient Egypt was much lower than in modern times. The older a pharaoh was at the time of his accession, the less time they would have to enjoy their exalted position. Having a pharaoh rule for 30 years was rare enough, especially when most men were dead before 40. If a pharaoh came to the throne at age 10, he would have to live past the typical life expectancy just to get to his first Heb-Sed festival. Many Egyptians would go their entire lives and not witness a single one. So when one of these happened, it was a huge deal, and the whole king celebrated and partied and drank and feasted. But Ramses, you will recall, lived a very long time, into his 90s and more than twice the average life expectancy of an Egyptian man. So not only did Ramses get to enjoy his Heb-Sed festival, but, given his long life, he just kept having them. As mentioned above, a king could choose to conduct another festival every 3 years after his first, but Ramses, never one for patience, chose to shorten this to 2 years from time to time. In the course of his long reign, Ramses II celebrated either 13 or 14 Heb-Sed festivals. I don't know about you, but I find the idea of an aged Ramses, knocking on 90, stooped with arthritis, running the ceremonial race circuit, and showing all the people that he might be old, but he is still the divine god king. It's awesome. By the way, the arthritis comment isn't an embellishment. Medical examination of his mummy reveals that he did indeed suffer from the affliction. So not only did I learn about the Heb-Sed festival, but I also learned that Ramses got to hold more of them than any other ruler in Egyptian history. Most Egyptians throughout the country's history would have lived without witnessing a Heb-Sed festival, but the people that lived during Ramses' reign, especially those born closer to his 30th regnal year, would not have known a life without them being celebrated every 2 to 3 years. The Heb-Sed festival served many important purposes in Egyptian society, but chief among these was reinforcing the divine status of the pharaoh. The exact nature of how the Egyptians thought about pharaonic divinity is a topic of debate. However, it seems that the people believed that kingship itself had a divine force, and that the pharaoh, while still a mortal man, was imbued with these divine powers once on the throne. It was the pharaoh's duty to serve as the intermediary between the gods and the people, and to keep the balance, order, and prosperity flowing throughout the kingdom. After death, pharaohs would be fully deified, and for many, royal cults would continue to promulgate the worship of the pharaoh long after his death. Ramses would have been worshipped as semi-divine in his lifetime and fully so after his death. It seems to some scholars that Ramses took this step a bit further, declaring himself to be fully divine even while still living. Some sources suggest that it was at his first Heb-Sed festival that Ramses chose to announce his divine status to the world. If he truly did so, either at the festival or at some other time, then this would be another example of Ramses taking a long-established Egyptian custom of elevating the pharaoh and elevating himself yet further still. So, the Heb-Sed festival, and all the ways that Ramses used it to exalt himself way past the norms and customs of Egyptian pharaohs, is fun new thing number one. I wouldn't say that this information changed how I viewed Ramses. I find him vainglorious, even with his many notable accomplishments. I begrudgingly admit that he was good at his job, even if it comes across as a bit insufferable. But new thing number two has softened on me, if only just a tiny bit. Now, if you recall the Ramses episodes, you will remember that he had 8 royal wives, including Hittite princesses and even his own daughters. Ew. Besides these queens, he had several hundred more concubines. On balance, this didn't exactly endear me to Ramses. It would seem the only person Ramses could love was Ramses. But I might have misjudged him a little bit. For it seems that he did truly love his first great royal wife, the Queen Nefertari, whom he seems to have married before his accession to the throne. Nefertari seems to have been deserving of his adulation. She was, in equal measure, a great beauty and a great intellect. In the Sargon bonus episode, we met the Akkadian king's remarkable daughter, Enheduanna, considered to be the first author in human history, as she was the first person to whom specific works could be attributed. Part of what made Enheduanna so unique for her time was that she was fully literate. This is certainly true of Nefertari also, as she, likewise, could read and write the complex Egyptian hieroglyphic system. Like Enheduanna, Nefertari used her intellectual skills to further the administrative goals of her relations. She wrote letters and corresponded with other important people of the day. In this, she furthered the communications between Ramses and nobles and royals from all over the Near East. We know of Ramses' devotion to Nefertari in a few ways. First and most simple is the meaning of her names. Nefertari translates to something akin to beautiful companion. Her second name, Merimut, means beloved of Mut, an important goddess in the Egyptian pantheon. Mut was the consort of Amun, the chief god of the Egyptian pantheon during the 19th dynasty and the deity to which Ramses associated himself. But these names were just part of her royal titles. You may recall from part 2 of the Thutmose III episode that Egyptian royals had really long titles, which had multiple meanings. You may even remember that I emphasize tried, to pronounce the full regnal title of Thutmose. I won't make you suffer through such a thing again, and will instead skip to the translation of her many names, which include Great of Praises, Sweet of Love, Lady of Grace, Great King's Wife, King's Beloved. It seems as though Ramses even had several pet names for her, including the God's Wife and the One for Whom the Sun Shines. Still, despite her exalted status, little was known of Queen Nefertari for a long time. with sculptures and fragmentary inscriptions offering tantalizing hints but an incomplete picture. This seems to be due, in large part, to her early and untimely death, at least as compared to her long-lived husband. She seems to have died around 1255 BCE, about 24 years into Ramses' reign, and more than 4 decades before his own eventual death. Then, in 1904, a staggering discovery changed what we know not only about Nefertari, but also Egyptian religious and funerary practices. This happened when her tomb, designated as KV66, was discovered by Italian Egyptologist Ernesto Schiaparelli. The tomb of Nefertari is one of the most spectacular and important discoveries of ancient Egypt. It is dubbed the Sistine Chapel of Egypt, and it is an artistic masterpiece. What's more, it contains numerous painting panels that were remarkably well preserved, with some sites and travel guides depicting it as looking as though it were painted yesterday. Thousands of stars are painted on the ceiling to reflect the cosmos. The queen is described in almost breathless tones as of unsurpassed dignity, character, and beauty. Special attention is paid to details about things like the shape of her eyes and the hue of her skin. We can almost hear Ramses' bittersweet paeans to his beloved queen, his longing for her even after her death, his praises of and exhortations to all to remember her. The decorative panels also reveal very important details about Egyptian funerary customs, as her tomb has the most complete and detailed depictions of key passages of the legendary Egyptian Book of the Dead, which outlines the various rituals, spells, and incantations that would be part of an Egyptian royal funeral. Thus, in the discovery of this tomb, Egyptologists catapulted forward their knowledge of Egyptian funerary and religious practices. As we discussed in the Ramses episodes, other tombs associated with him, such as the one for his kids, would become quite crowded, with lots of royals joining one another in shared accommodations. But Nefertari seems to have had a tomb to herself, surrounded by odes and praises from Ramses to his beloved queen. I mentioned a moment ago that learning about this tomb and Ramses' seemingly genuine devotion to Nefertari softened me on him just a bit. Maybe all the other wives and concubines were not an expression of his narcissism. Maybe, just maybe, he was bereft, and even subconsciously expressing that no amount of wives and concubines could replace his one true love. I mean, it's Ramses, so I'm probably getting a little carried away, but I do think it's safe to say that Ramses loved at least one person beside himself. And that's got to count for something, right? Given how self-obsessed this dude was, Nefertari had to be pretty amazing to divert his affection away from himself and toward her. So that is number 2. The third new fun fact about Ramses relates to what happened after he died. A moment ago, I mentioned that most pharaohs didn't live long enough to celebrate one Heb-Sed festival, let alone 13 or 14. I also mentioned that most Egyptians lived during his reign didn't know life without these festivals. In fact, Ramses lived for so long that 2 whole generations of Egyptians only knew life with him as the pharaoh. When he finally died, no one alive could remember a time before Ramses was pharaoh. It's likely that he was the oldest living human at that point, and even more likely that he was the oldest Egyptian. In fact, when he died, Egypt was gripped with fear and panic, as many people believed that when he died, the world would end. Given how long he ruled, and Egypt's relationship with divinity, this is a bit understandable. But several millennia later, we're still here. And yet, Ramses just keeps making headlines. Archaeologists are still finding new things about this guy all the time. Back in the Sargon bonus episode, I lamented that one thing that hadn't changed from my first to my bonus episodes about the Great Akkadian was that Sargon's great capital of Akkad was still lost, still evading rediscovery. Ramses, it would seem, had no such compunctions about giving up long-lost secrets. His name, image, and likeness keep showing up everywhere. In his episodes, and again a few minutes ago, I shared that he commissioned a lot of statues, temples, and inscriptions to elevate himself above all other Egyptians, past, present, and future. He even recarved or reinscribed monuments from predecessors in his image and to boast of his greatness. But now, even now, Ramses still seems determined to dominate the headlines. New things are being found about this guy all the darn time. For example, the upper half of a monumental 12.5-foot tall statue of Ramses II was unearthed just a few months ago, solving a long-lost riddle. Also, back in 2023, archaeologists discovered 2,000 mummified ram's heads that had apparently been offered in the cult worship of the pharaoh. And just a few weeks before the release of this bonus episode, archaeologists made a truly staggering discovery, finding what has been identified as the original sarcophagus of the great king. I could go on and on with more examples, but it's safe to say that new artifacts are being unearthed with surprising frequency about Ramses. He still wants us to find him, to study him, and to pay attention to him. Even though I have now done a bonus episode for each of the first 3 subjects of this series, I'm not sure that I will do one for every one going forward. But in the case of Ramses, I had a unique motivation, a reason I felt a stronger connection to him. I met his grandfather. Not long after my wife and I moved to Atlanta, scientists at Emory University announced that they believed they had identified a mummy in their antiquities collection as that of Ramses I. This mummy had come into their collection in 1999 when the Carlos Museum at Emory bought the entire antiquities collection from the Niagara Falls Museum in Canada. That museum had acquired the mummy all the way back in the 1860s in Luxor, Egypt, by an agent working for the museum. It was right around this time that the royal cache at Deir el Bahari, that hoard of royal mummies that I talked about in both the Ramses and Thutmose episodes, had been discovered. It seems likely that the mummy of Ramses I had been stolen from this cache and sold in a transaction of dubious legality before anyone could take a shot at identifying the long-dead royal. Once Emory took possession of the mummy, it became apparent that this had been a very important figure indeed. The mummy was exceptionally well preserved, and the position of its arms, folded across its chest, was reserved exclusively for royals until the Persian era. Based on careful analysis, the Emory team determined that the mummy was that of Ramses I, and they voluntarily offered to return him to Egypt, an offer that was accepted. Before he went home, though, Emory threw the king a party. In an exhibition called Ramses I, Science and the Search for the Lost Pharaoh, the Carlos Museum put the pharaoh on display and curated an exhibit about him, the dynasty he founded, and the process their team had used to make their identification. It was at this exhibition that I encountered the great king, coming face to face with the founder of the 19th dynasty, the father of Seti I and the grandfather of Ramses II. If you listen to the Ramses II episodes, you will remember that Ramses I came to the throne during the period of deep instability following the chaos of the Amarna period and the heretic Akhenaten. With his predecessor Horemheb, the last pharaoh of the 18th dynasty, Ramses I was the ruler that set Egypt back on a path of power and glory that would reach its apogee during the reign of Ramses II. And I got to say hello in person, and I got to wish him well on his return journey. Back in the Ramses II episode, I shared the strange journey of the great pharaoh that included his issuance of an Egyptian passport as his body traveled internationally for the first time in 3 millennia. I guess it turns out that long international journeys, a few thousand years after death, ran in the family. Life is more fun when you keep learning. Thanks for letting me share this with you. Let's keep learning together. If you are just tuning into this series and you haven't had a chance yet, be sure to go back and listen to the episodes about Ramses the Great, and for that matter, the ones both before and after. I am thrilled that you found this series. Welcome. Thank you for listening to this bonus episode. I'm grateful that you did. This series will continue with its regular release, so join us on the next one when we get to know a ruler who pushed the mighty Persian Empire to its greatest heights in size, power, and glory, Darius the Great.